Meridian Station's contractor processing hub operated with the aesthetic ambition of a place that had given up. The walls were industrial gray. The lighting was the flat, shadowless white that facilities management installed when the budget specified functional, and the requisition form did not include a checkbox for bearable. The chairs were bolted to the floor in rows, designed for a species-averaged ergonomic baseline that achieved the notable distinction of being equally uncomfortable for everyone, which the station's facilities director considered a form of equity, and which the people sitting in the chairs considered a form of punishment. Cade Nolan sat in the third row and waited for his number to be called, because the biometric registration process for the Velithi diplomatic protection contract was being conducted with the same bureaucratic methodology that every military-adjacent administrative process employed. Sequential processing, standardized forms, and the implicit assumption that the people being processed had infinite time and minimal dignity. He had been waiting for 40 minutes. He would wait for however long the process required, because waiting was a skill he had developed early and had never stopped needing, and because the contract on the other side of the waiting paid well enough that the waiting was, by the economic calculus that governed his professional decisions, an acceptable investment. He was 31. He looked older in the way that people looked older when the years they had lived contained more experience per unit of time than biology had budgeted for. His face was lean, angular, carrying the particular weathering that a life conducted primarily outdoors and primarily in hostile environments produced. Not aged but eroded, the features sharp, and defined in the way that features became sharp when the softness that youth provided had been consumed by circumstances that did not concern themselves with preserving it. His jaw was strong, set in the neutral expression that was his default and that communicated, to people who knew how to read faces shaped by conflict, that this person's baseline was not relaxed but managed, composure maintained through practice rather than temperament. The face of someone who had learned to control his expression before he had learned to control much else. His eyes were gray, light gray, pale enough to be striking against the tanned, weather-marked skin of his face, and they carried the quality that mercenary recruiters described as operational awareness, and that psychologists would have described as hypervigilance if anyone had ever sent him to a psychologist, which no one had because the mercenary profession did not include a mental health benefits package, and because Cade would not have gone if it did. His eyes tracked movement. They tracked it continuously, automatically, the way a compass needle tracked north, not because he chose to, but because the tracking was embedded in his perceptual architecture by 13 years of combat experience beginning at an age when the architecture was still forming, and the tracking became foundational rather than supplementary. His hair was dark, cut short, maintained at a length that required no attention because attention to grooming was attention not directed at the environment, and his environment had been, for the majority of his life, the kind that punished inattention. He was lean, built with the dense, functional economy that combat produced, not large, not imposing, but carrying his frame with the specific efficiency of a body that had been trained by necessity rather than design, every muscle serving a purpose, no mass that did not contribute to the requirements of a profession that demanded speed, endurance, and the capacity to absorb damage without losing function. His arms were scarred, not decoratively, not in the patterns that some species ritualized. His scars were the accumulated record of 18 years of professional violence, a topographical history of engagements written on his skin in the language of plasma burns, kinetic impacts, and edged weapons that had found their targets. The scars were most concentrated on his left side, forearm, shoulder, the line of his ribs, a cluster of old, deep scarring that predated his mercenary career and that marked, for anyone who could read the language of combat injury, a specific kind of engagement. Close range, sustained, the kind of scarring produced when a body absorbed fire at a distance that was closer than any engagement should permit, because the person absorbing the fire was not maintaining distance but holding position. He was wearing the standard contractor's kit that the Mercenary Guild required for formal processing: functional clothing, weapons secured, identification visible. His sidearm was holstered at his right hip. His posture in the uncomfortable chair was the posture of someone who could wait indefinitely, because waiting was a condition rather than an activity, and conditions were endured rather than experienced. His number was called. He stood, collected his identification, and walked to the processing station with the measured stride of a man who moved through institutional spaces the way he moved through all spaces, efficiently, with an awareness of exits and sightlines that operated below conscious intention, and that was, to him, as unremarkable as breathing. The Ascending Light's security processing bay was more sophisticated than the contractor hub, but no more comfortable, because Velithi military architecture prioritized function with the same dedication that it prioritized elegance in civilian spaces. And the result was a room that operated beautifully and felt like the inside of a tool. The biometric scanner was Velitha standard, more advanced than human equivalents, capable of deeper tissue mapping and more comprehensive identity verification. Cade placed his hand on the scanner plate, looked into the retinal reader, and waited while the system did what biometric systems did: confirmed that he was who he said he was, and checked whether who he said he was had any outstanding alerts that would make his presence on a sovereign diplomatic vessel inadvisable. The scan completed. The data populated the processing display, and on the observation screen in the adjacent monitoring position, where Empress Selara Vorkethan was reviewing contractor files with the attentive thoroughness that she applied to all security assessments, the same data appeared. The sound the Empress made was not a sound. It was the absence of sound, the cessation of the ambient signals that a living being produced through breathing, movement, and the involuntary processes that biology maintained without conscious direction. She stopped, not in the way that people stopped when they received unexpected information. That was a pause, a momentary interruption followed by resumed function. This was a stop, a full system suspension that her security chief, standing 3 meters to her left, recognized with the professional alarm of someone whose training included identifying medical emergencies in the sovereign, and whose assessment of the Empress's current state was that the differential between medical emergency and what was actually happening was narrower than he was comfortable with. Her bioluminescent patterns detonated. The controlled silver blue of administrative focus shattered into a cascade that her security chief had never seen in 20 years of service. Colors moving at velocities that the Velithi chromatic system produced only under extreme neurological load, the biological equivalent of every alarm firing simultaneously. Deep violet, bright copper, flashes of white that pulsed and vanished, and beneath the chaos, rising with the slow, inevitable force of something that had been buried for years and was now surfacing despite every structural layer that had been placed over it, a color that the Velithi chromatic lexicon classified as Velthenes, the recognition of the sacred. Gold, deep, luminous, suffusing the patterns along her temples and the bridge of her nose, and the line of her jaw with a warmth that transformed the cool precision of her features into something that was less sovereign and more human, if human meant the quality of being overwhelmed by something your composure could not contain. Her entourage froze because she froze. 6 advisory staff, 4 security personnel, 2 diplomatic attachés, all of them calibrated their behavior to the Empress's, and when the Empress became a statue with bioluminescent patterns cycling at crisis velocities, the room became a tableau of people who did not know what was happening, and who were experiencing the particular anxiety of highly trained professionals encountering a situation their training had not covered. Selara was staring at the biometric display, specifically at the scar pattern mapping, The topographical body scan that the biometric system produced as part of identity verification, a three-dimensional rendering of the contractor's physical features including tissue damage that was unique enough to serve as secondary identification. The scar mapping on her screen showed a concentration of old, deep scarring on the left side of the body, forearm, shoulder, ribs. Plasma burns, consistent with close-range sustained fire. Kinetic impact trauma, consistent with fragmentation at near distance. The pattern was asymmetric, concentrated on the body's left side in a distribution that was consistent with, and here the biometric system provided a clinical notation that it generated automatically based on injury pattern analysis. A defensive posture oriented to protect the right flank while absorbing fire from the left. The posture of someone shielding something or someone behind them while facing a threat from ahead and to the left. The security chief stepped forward. "Your Majesty." "Leave." The word was quiet. It carried the absolute authority that sovereign voices carried when the sovereign was not performing authority but inhabiting it. When the command was not a demonstration of power, but an expression of need so fundamental that the voice did not modulate but simply spoke, and the speaking was enough. "Everyone now." They left. The security chief hesitated. His professional mandate was to remain with the sovereign at all times. But the Empress's golden eyes found his, and what he saw in them overrode 20 years of training, because what he saw was not a security concern, but something private, something that the most powerful woman in the sovereignty was experiencing with an intensity that made her simultaneously the most commanding and the most vulnerable person he had ever seen. And vulnerability in a sovereign was something that a good security chief protected by providing the privacy the vulnerability required. The room emptied. Cade stood at the biometric station, his hand still resting on the scanner plate, watching the room empty with the alert, assessing a tension that was his default response to unexpected developments, and that was, in this moment, providing no useful information because the development he was observing, an alien empress dismissing her entire entourage after looking at his biometric scan, did not correspond to any situation his 18 years of professional experience had prepared him to interpret. Celara walked toward him. She walked with the measured control of someone who was managing the distance between composure and its absence, and who was using the physical act of walking, one foot, then the other, the simple mechanics of forward motion, as the framework that held everything else in place. She stopped approximately 2 meters from him. The distance was not diplomatic. It was the distance that her body chose. The distance at which her enhanced Veilithi perception could process every detail of his face with the resolution that her visual architecture provided, and that she was now deploying not for assessment but for identification, comparing what she saw with what she remembered. Across 18 years, and the transformation that 18 years had performed on the face of a child, she had last seen bleeding on a station floor. She was tall 6 feet, with the refined proportions that Veilithi imperial lineage produced. Her skin was deep golden bronze, carrying the matte luminosity that her species' pigmentation generated. Her features held the architectural precision that characterized Veilithi's sovereign bloodlines: high cheekbones, sharp and sculpted, a jaw that tapered with geometric elegance. Her eyes were gold, deep, luminous, the enhanced pupil architecture giving them an intensity that operated at a resolution most species could not achieve. Her hair was dark auburn, long, arranged in the formal style that diplomatic travel required. She was 34. She had been 16 at Station 7 Gamma. The bioluminescent patterns along her temples had not stabilized. The gold of Velthini's remained deep and warm, pulsing in rhythms that were not controlled but organic, the body's honest response to what the mind was processing. She looked at his face. She looked at the scars visible on his left arm below the rolled sleeve of his contractor's jacket. She looked at his gray eyes, which were watching her with the focused, assessing attention that had been looking at everything the same way for 18 years, and that she recognized, with a shock that added another layer to the already overwhelming experience of this moment, because she had seen those eyes before, younger, wider, filled with a different kind of intensity, but the same eyes, the same pale gray that had stared down a corridor full of death while she ran behind him. "Station 7 Gamma," she whispered, "18 years ago." The words landed in the architecture of Cade's memory like a stone thrown through a window that had been sealed for nearly 2 decades. And the window shattered, and the room behind it, the room he had built walls around, the room he had sealed with the only technique available to a child who experienced horror before he had the vocabulary to name it, opened. 7 Gamma, the station's designation. He had not said it aloud in 18 years. He had not allowed it to surface, not because he chose suppression consciously, but because the suppression had been installed at 13, when his mind was still forming, and the wall it built became part of the formation, a structural element rather than an addition, load-bearing in the way that walls became load-bearing when they were built early enough that the architecture grew around them. The wall cracked. He remembered the corridor. He remembered the length of it, 40 meters, maybe 50, industrial construction, the walls scored with blast marks from fighting that had already passed through. He remembered the sound, weapons fire from multiple directions, the percussion of kinetic rounds and the higher-pitched whine of plasma discharge, and beneath it, behind him, the sound of people running. Not soldiers, civilians. The irregular rhythm of feet that were not trained to move under fire, and that were moving anyway. Because the corridor led to the evacuation shuttles, and the shuttles were leaving, and the corridor was the only path. He remembered being at the end of the corridor. The chokepoint, a structural narrowing where blast doors had partially closed and created a bottleneck that one person could hold because one person was all the opening could accommodate. He remembered the weapon in his hands, a standard colonial infantry rifle, too large for his 13-year-old frame, braced against his shoulder with the compensating technique that undersized soldiers developed when the equipment was not built for their bodies, and their bodies had to adapt rather than the other way around. He remembered firing. He remembered the heat of the weapon, the progressive failure of the cooling system as sustained fire pushed it beyond its operational parameters. He remembered the barrel glowing. He remembered switching to a replacement weapon, pulled from a dead garrison soldier, whose body was close enough to reach without leaving the chokepoint. And the weapon was warm from the dead soldier's last use, and the warmth was the temperature of recent life and recent death. And he did not think about it because thinking was not available. Only shooting was available. And the shooting continued, because the people behind him were still moving, and the people in front of him were still coming. He remembered the impacts. The first one hit his left forearm, plasma, the specific searing absence of sensation that plasma produced as it converted tissue to something that was no longer tissue. The second was kinetic, fragmentation, the ribs on his left side absorbing shrapnel that his body registered as pressure before it registered as pain. The third and fourth and subsequent impacts blurred into a continuous experience of being hit and continuing to function. The body's desperate, animal refusal to stop performing the task it was performing even as the task consumed it. He remembered collapsing. The corridor's floor, coming up to meet him with the slow-motion quality that blood loss produced, the world narrowing to a tunnel and the tunnel narrowing to a point, and the point going dark. He remembered waking. The triage center, the lights, the commendations, paper documents, physical printouts because the station's digital systems had been destroyed, handed to him by an administrator who looked at him with an expression that contained pity and discomfort in equal measure. Because handing commendations to a 13-year-old in a hospital bed for actions that no 13-year-old should have been required to perform was an administrative duty that the commendation system had not been designed for. He did not remember the civilians. He had not looked behind him during the engagement because looking behind him meant turning away from the front, and turning away meant stopping, and stopping meant the corridor opened. He knew, abstractly, that people had passed through while he held the chokepoint. He did not know how many. He did not know who. He had never tried to find out because finding out required opening the room he had sealed, and the room's contents were not things he had the tools to process, and the absence of tools had not changed in 18 years. Yes, he said, one word. His voice was level, the practiced, managed level that 18 years of professional composure provided, but the eyes above the level voice were not level. The gray was bright, not wet. Bright in the way that eyes became bright when the things behind them pressed forward against the containment that usually held them, and the containment flexed. You held the corridor, Selara said, and her voice had the quality of a person saying something they had said before, in speeches, in ceremonies, in the private prayers that sovereigns conducted in the hours when sovereignty was heaviest, but who was now saying it to the person the words were about. And the difference between saying it to an idea and saying it to the man standing in front of her was the difference between reading about fire and standing in it. I was there, Cade said. I was the one who was there, that's all. That is not all. The gold in her bioluminescent patterns pulsed, deep, warm, carrying the harmonic resonance of something that the Velithi chromatic lexicon reserved for moments of sacred recognition. 312 civilians passed through that corridor. I was one of them. I was 16. I was part of a diplomatic observer delegation that was overtaken by the fighting. Her voice shifted. The sovereign register gave way to something rower and younger, the voice not of the Empress but of the girl who had been. I was terrified, and you were standing at the end of the corridor, and you were a child, and you were bleeding, and you did not move. The private conference room was Selara's suggestion, because the biometric processing bay was not the appropriate venue for what the conversation had become, and because the Empress, for all that her composure had been shattered by a biometric scan, retained the sovereign's instinct for controlling the environment in which significant events occurred. The conference room was small, secure, furnished with the functional simplicity that Velithi military vessels maintained in working spaces. 2 chairs, a table, the soft ambient lighting that Velithi architecture used in spaces designed for conversation rather than ceremony. Cade sat because standing required energy that the memories currently consuming his cognitive resources were not leaving available. Selara sat opposite him. The distance between them was the table's width, approximately 1 meter, and the meter contained 18 years of divergent history that had begun in the same corridor, and had led in directions so different that the starting point seemed impossible in retrospect. You searched for me, Cade said. It was not a question. The Empress's reaction to his biometric scan, the cascade, the dismissal of her entourage, the whispered question that located him in time and space with the precision of someone who had been looking for exactly those coordinates for 18 years, communicated that the search had been sustained and thorough. For 18 years. Selara's voice had settled into the register that existed between sovereign composure and personal honesty, controlled but not performed, the voice of a woman who was accustomed to measuring her words and who had decided in this room to measure them for accuracy rather than impact. After 7 Gamma, the survivors, the Velithi civilians who evacuated through the corridor, returned to the sovereignty with accounts of what happened. The accounts were consistent. A human child, young, armed, standing at the chokepoint while 300 civilians passed behind him, fighting until he fell. Her bioluminescent patterns shifted, deep gold threading with violet, the chromatic signature of something being retrieved from the place where a person stored the things that shaped them most. I was the last through the corridor, the last before the shuttles launched. I saw you fall. Cade's gray eyes held hers. The brightness was still there, the internal pressure against containment, but the containment held because it had been holding for 18 years and it was strong. The story became foundational, Selara continued. In our culture, sacrifice, genuine sacrifice, where the cost is borne without certainty of reward, is the highest expression of martial honor. What you did at 7 Gamma was not strategy. It was not professional. It was a child standing in a corridor because the only alternative was moving, and moving meant people died. The purity of it, the absence of calculation, made it sacred in our framework. I was 13. I didn't have any calculation to apply. I was there and they were coming and the people behind me were running. That's it. Yes, that's exactly it. And the fact that that's exactly it is why it became what it became. She paused. I commissioned a monument, in the Capitol, an unnamed figure. We didn't know your name, we didn't know your face, holding a corridor. It stands in the Plaza of Honored Sacrifice, which is the most sacred public space in the sovereignty. Every Velithi child learns the story. Every military officer studies the engagement as a case study in the principle that position and will can outweigh force and numbers. Your stand at 7 Gamma is taught in our academies as the purest example of protective sacrifice in our recorded history. Cade sat with this information the way he sat with all information that exceeded his processing capacity. Still, absorbing, letting the excess wash over the containment without attempting to capture all of it. A monument, academies, a sacred plaza. The child who shot until his rifle melted, remembered not as a war orphan or a child soldier or a casualty statistic, but as a legend, a principle, a story told to alien children on a world he had never visited about a moment he had spent 18 years trying not to remember. I was listed as presumed dead, he said. The colonial casualty records were fragmentary. The administration, a flash of something moved through her expression that was less sovereign and more specific, the controlled anger of someone who had encountered bureaucratic failure in a context where the failure had personal consequences. The colonial administration classified the engagement as a minor skirmish. The casualty records from 7 Gamma were incomplete, contradictory, and partially corrupted. Your name appeared in one database as deceased, in another as transferred, in a third as unregistered. The search teams I funded could not reconcile the records. After 12 years of active searching, my intelligence directorate concluded that the most likely explanation was that you had died of your injuries in a facility that did not properly record the death. I woke up in a triage center, commendations, recovery, released to the irregular combatant resettlement program, which means they gave me a transport voucher and told me I was a civilian now. The words came out flat, factual, the voice of someone reporting data rather than recounting experience. I was 14, no family, no placement. The voucher got me to Meridian Station. The Mercenary Guild accepted applications at 16. I lied about my age and signed at 15. Celara's patterns shifted. The gold dimmed, not extinguished but compressed, pressed down by something darker that moved through her chromatic display with the slow, heavy quality of an emotion that was too large to express and too honest to suppress. She was looking at him with an expression that Cade could read even without knowledge of Velithi facial interpretation, because the expression existed in the universal language of people confronting something they had not wanted to see. The expression of a woman who had spent 18 years honoring a sacrifice and who was now seeing what the sacrifice had cost the person who made it. You became a mercenary, she said. Yes. The child who held the corridor, who embodied everything my civilization holds sacred about sacrifice and honor and protective duty, grew up to sell violence to the highest bidder. The child who held the corridor didn't have a lot of options after he stopped holding it. Cade's voice was not bitter. Bitterness required energy directed at the past, and Cade's energy was directed at the present because the present was where the contracts were, and the contracts were where the survival was. Nobody came back. The commendations were nice. The commendations did not pay for food or shelter or the education I didn't get because I was 13 and shooting instead of studying. The Mercenary Guild offered a career that used the only skill set I had: fighting. The colony wars taught me to fight. The guild taught me to get paid for it. And the sacrifice didn't pay the bills. The gray eyes held hers, and what they contained was not anger or accusation, but the worst thing: the simple, settled understanding of someone who had processed his own history long ago, and who had arrived at conclusions that could not be challenged, because they were not opinions but facts. You built monuments, you taught the story in academies, you honored the sacrifice. I appreciate that. I mean that I appreciate it. But the sacrifice and the monuments existed in different worlds. Your world had the monuments. My world had the morning after. And the morning after the corridor, I was a 13-year-old with no family, no education, and scar tissue on half my body, and the universe's plan for me was not a monument. It was a choice between starving and fighting, and I chose fighting because fighting was what I knew. The conference room held the silence that followed the way a container held a liquid, completely, with the silence filling every space the room provided and pressing against the walls with the weight of everything it contained. Celara's bioluminescent patterns were moving in rhythms that Cade could not interpret, and that Vareth Tal Cassis, had he been present, would have described as the chromatic expression of a sovereign experiencing the collision of two realities that had coexisted in her mind as separate narratives, and that were now merging into a single story, whose moral was more complicated and more painful than either narrative had been alone. The sacred child and the mercenary, the legend and the man, the sacrifice she had honored and the survival that followed the sacrifice, unwitnessed, unhonored, and conducted with the pragmatic brutality that survival required when no one was watching and no one was helping, and the only person who could help was the person who needed help. "I failed you," she said, and the gold in her patterns flared, not with sacred recognition, but with something rawer, something that was not Velthini's but its darker companion, the acknowledgement of a debt so fundamental that its existence changed the debtor. "I honored the sacrifice, and I did not find the child who made it. I built monuments, and I did not build a search that worked. I told the story for 18 years, and the person the story was about was alive, working, getting by." Cade's voice softened, not much, not the dramatic softening that performance produced, but the fractional shift that genuine emotional modulation produced when someone who controlled their voice tightly allowed a millimeter of slack. "You didn't fail me, you didn't know. The records were broken, the systems were broken. I was listed as dead. You searched for someone you believed had died saving you, and you honored him. That's not failure, that's more than anyone else did. It is not enough. It is what it is, it's always what it is. The corridor happened, I held it, you got through, I survived, I became what I became, you became what you became, and here we are." Here they were, an empress and a mercenary, sitting across a table on a diplomatic cruiser, separated by 18 years that had turned a child into a weapon and a girl into a sovereign, and that had, through the mechanism of a biometric scan and a scar pattern match, brought them back to the same room, not the same people, not the same relationship, but the same origin, the same corridor, the same moment of violence and flight, and the terrible, permanent bond that formed between the person who stayed and the person who ran. "The contract," Cade said, because the contract was the structure he understood, and the conversation had moved into territory where structure was necessary to prevent the territory from becoming unnavigable. Celara looked at him. "The contract. 6 weeks protection detail, hazard premium, standard terms. I accepted the posting before the biometric registration. The work hasn't changed." "Everything has changed." "The work hasn't. You need transit security for a diplomatic summit. I'm contracted to provide it. Unless you want to void the contract based on," he searched for the appropriate word, "conflict of interest." "Is there a conflict of interest?" "You tell me. You're the principal. I'm the contractor. The relationship is professional. The history is another search. The word he found was not in any professional vocabulary, but in the older, simpler vocabulary that preceded all professional vocabularies. Personal, but personal doesn't change the work. It's never changed the work. The Empress studied him with the full resolution of Valithi-enhanced perception. The face, the scars, the gray eyes that held hers with the steady, managed attention that had been his primary tool for 18 years, and that she was seeing, for the first time, not as a professional mask, but as the visible surface of a coping architecture built by a child who had needed to survive, and who had built what he needed from the only materials available. The contract stands, she said, not because the work is unchanged, because you are right that the work remains the work, and because her bioluminescent patterns shifted into the deep gold once more. But the gold was different now, steadier, tempered by the darker colors that their conversation had produced, carrying the warmth of the sacred recognition, and the weight of the knowledge that the sacred and the pragmatic were not opposed, but entangled. The same story told from two positions that had never before compared their views. Because I spent 18 years honoring a monument, and the monument is alive and standing in front of me. And he is not what I imagined, and he is not what I hoped, and he is exactly what the corridor produced, and I will not lose him again. You're not losing me, you're hiring me, those are different things. For now, the word now carried an implication that Cade heard and did not address because addressing it would require engaging with a future that his professional methodology did not plan for. Mercenaries operated in contract cycles, not timelines, and the cycle currently relevant was 6 weeks of transit security, and whatever existed beyond 6 weeks was beyond 6 weeks and therefore not yet real. He stood. The chair scraped against the conference room's floor, a small, ordinary sound that existed in the same room as the extraordinary conversation, and that grounded the conversation in the physical reality that Cade preferred to the emotional territory they had been navigating. I'll report to the security chief for assignment, he said. Standard protocol, rotation schedule, posted sectors, rules of engagement. Cade, his name from her mouth. Not contractor, not mercenary, not the formal address that sovereigns used for hired personnel. His name, spoken with the harmonic depth that Valithi voices produced when the words they were carrying mattered more than the words could contain. He paused at the door. He did not turn fully, the quarter turn of someone who was listening, but who had committed to forward motion, and was not yet willing to relinquish the momentum that leaving provided. I was 16 when I ran through that corridor, Selara said. I have spent 18 years becoming the woman who could deserve to have been saved by what you did. I have governed with the story of your courage as the standard I held myself to. And I will not pretend that finding you, alive here, holding a contract instead of a rifle, is not the most significant thing that has happened to me since the day you held that corridor. Her golden eyes held his gray ones across the room's length. The contract is 6 weeks. What I owe you is longer. What I want to understand about the person you became is longer. And what we are to each other, the girl who ran and the boy who stayed, that does not have a duration, and it does not have terms, and it is not contained by a contract. Cade stood at the door with 18 years of professional detachment and 13 years of childhood that preceded it, and somewhere beneath both. Beneath the mercenary, beneath the orphan, beneath the weapon that the colony wars forged from a child who should have been in school. The boy who held the corridor heard the girl he had held it for, and the hearing produced something that his containment architecture had not been designed to manage, and that manifested not in his face, which remained composed, and not in his voice, which remained level, but in his eyes, which were gray and bright, and that held, for a moment that the room preserved in its silence, the uncontainable evidence that the wall he had built at 13 had a crack in it, and the crack was shaped like a corridor, and through it. After 18 years light. 6 weeks, he said, we'll start there. He left the conference room. He reported to the security chief. He accepted his rotation assignment and reviewed the posted sectors, and memorized the rules of engagement with the methodical thoroughness that his professional standards required. He did the work because the work was the work, and the work did not change because the principal turned out to be the girl from the corridor. But the work felt different. The protection detail, the standard contract obligation to ensure the safety of the diplomatic delegation, carried a weight it had not carried before his biometric scan populated a screen, and an Empress whispered the name of a station he had spent 18 years trying to forget. It carried the weight of a corridor. It carried the weight of a child who stayed. And it carried, beneath the professional language of contracts and rotations and rules of engagement, something older and simpler and more honest. The recognition that the work he had been doing for 18 years, protecting people for money, had begun before the money as something else. Something that a 13-year-old understood without words, and that the 31-year-old had buried beneath words. Something that was not for sale because it predated the selling, and because it was, in the architecture of who he was, the foundation that everything else was built on. He protected people. That was the first thing. Before the contracts, before the guild, before the mercenaries' pragmatic exchange of violence for compensation. A child protected strangers because they were behind him, and the threat was in front of him, and there was no one else. The selling came after. The selling was survival, but the thing being sold, the willingness to stand between harm and the people behind you, that was not manufactured by the market. That was original. That was the corridor. Outside the conference room, aboard the ascending light, the diplomatic transit continued. Cade stood his post. Celara conducted her sovereign's duties. And between them, in the space that the biometric scan had opened, and that neither of them had closed, 18 years of divergent history began the slow, uncertain process of converging, not into the legend she had built or the career he had constructed, but into something that was neither monument nor contract but recognition. The girl and the boy, alive and changed and present, carrying the corridor between them like a weight they could finally share instead of